The doctor said it was the end. Until a poor girl walked into the hospital by mistake and touched the nose of the man in a coma, and in that instant, something impossible happened. The sun hadn't even beaten the morning fog yet when Grace arranged the little candy packets inside the bag. She slipped on her worn-out sandals, gave a light kiss on her sleeping grandmother's forehead, and whispered in the ear of her younger brother, still curled up under the thin blanket. "I'll be right back, Jacob." Downtown was buzzing with honking cars, hurried people, and distant sirens. Grace knew every corner, every traffic light. She was small, skinny, but sharp. She knew how to smile just right to sell 2 candies for 1 real. She knew when the city inspectors were around. And that day, she realized it too late. "Hey, girl, you can't be here," one of the city inspectors shouted. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, one barefoot foot slapping the ground, the other barely holding onto a sandal. She slipped through an open gate, past a busy reception area, and disappeared down one of the corridors of Riverside General Hospital. It wasn't the first time she used a big building as a hiding place, but it was the first time she felt that strange mix of alcohol and silence in the air. People spoke softly, walked fast. Grace walked slowly, trying to look invisible. At the end of the hallway, a half-open door caught her attention. Not because it was special, but because it looked forgotten. She stepped inside. Room 407. Inside, there was a bed, some machines, and an unmoving man. Tubes in his mouth, his nose, eyes closed, pale skin. The only thing moving was the heartbeat line on the monitor. She approached, curious. "Hi," she whispered, as if he could hear her. The man looked dead, but something about him reminded her of her grandfather. The same slightly furrowed brow, the same drooping mouth. Instinctively, Grace reached out and touched his nose with the tip of her finger. "Clown nose," she murmured, laughing softly. It was a game she played with her grandfather when he was very sick. She would tap his nose and say that. It was silly, but sometimes he smiled even when he could no longer talk. Suddenly, something moved. The man's fingers. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, but they moved. Grace froze. The monitor's sound didn't change, but she saw it with her own eyes. He moved his fingers. "Sir," she whispered, scared. Nothing. Silence again. She stepped back, bumped into the IV stand, almost knocking it over. Her heart felt like it was about to jump out of her mouth. She turned around and ran out of the room, disappearing down the hospital corridors. In the medical center, no one noticed anything until the night shift. One of the technicians reviewing the routine recordings paused the footage from room 407. "This is strange," he called to a nurse. On the video, a blurry image of a child entering the room. Then the patient's fingers moving. The same patient who, for 3 months, had shown no reaction to anything. Emily arrived at the hospital as she did every day. It had been her routine for 92 days. Walk in, sit beside her father, hold his hand, and try to talk, even without a response. "Good morning, Dad," she said, forcing a smile. She no longer expected miracles. She had heard all the statistics, all the bad prognoses. Michael Anderson, one of the most powerful businessmen in the state, was now an immobile body, trapped between tubes and machines. A silent stroke had pulled him from his active life straight into a deep coma. The head doctor knocked on the door of the room. "Emily, there's something you might want to see." In the conference room, Emily watched the footage closely. The internal camera showed the exact moment her father's fingers moved. And right before that, a girl, tiny, wearing simple clothes, her hair tied in a messy ponytail. "Who is that child?" Emily asked, serious. "We don't know. She's not listed as a visitor or a patient. She just walked in and left. And right after that," Emily pointed, My father moves his fingers. This has never happened before? The doctor shook his head. No reaction in 3 months. And yes, we have records of all neurological exams. Everything stable, no changes, until this. Emily fell silent. She didn't know what to think. A reflex? A coincidence? Or something else? Are you looking for that girl? She asked. Not yet, but we can check the external cameras, maybe figure out how she entered. Emily stared at the frozen image on the monitor. The girl looked scared, but there was a sweetness in the gesture of touching her father's nose. Something familiar, something intimate. Find her. I want to know who she is. On the other side of town, Grace returned home. Her grandmother was coughing loudly, sitting on the bed. Jacob was asking for food. She didn't mention anything about the strange man, or the fingers. She kept it to herself, like a secret, like something she didn't know how to explain. But that night, before falling asleep, she stared at the ceiling and whispered, "If you were trying to talk, I heard you, okay?" Across town, in the silent hospital, Michael's heart monitor sped up slightly. Grace couldn't get that room out of her mind. For days, she kept replaying in her head the image of that motionless man, the strange feeling she had when his fingers moved. She didn't tell anyone, not her grandmother, not Jacob. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same gesture, the fingers moving. Because of her. Going back to the hospital was dangerous. She knew that. The city inspectors could catch her. Security could throw her out. But the desire to understand what had happened was stronger than the fear. So, on a hot Wednesday morning, Grace grabbed her packets of candy, slipped into her worn-out sandals, and headed downtown. Only this time, instead of going to the traffic lights, she crossed the street and walked straight into Riverside General Hospital. The same hallway, the same half-open door. Only this time, someone was waiting. "It's you, isn't it?" Grace froze. A young, elegant woman with tired, steady eyes was standing at the doorway of room 407 watching her. "I saw you on the video," Emily said. "You came in here, and my father reacted." Grace lowered her eyes. Her face heated up. "I'm sorry, I just wanted to hide. I didn't know it was forbidden." Emily knelt down to be at the girl's height. "What's your name?" "Grace." "Grace." "My father hadn't reacted in 3 months, but the day you came here, he moved his fingers. I want to know if it happens again. Will you go in with me?" Grace hesitated, but the woman's tone wasn't angry. It was the tone of someone who had hope. "Okay," she replied. They entered together. Michael looked the same as before, eyes closed, tubes connecting his body to the machines. Grace walked closer, slowly. She looked at Emily, who nodded. "Go ahead." She reached out and touched the man's nose. "Clown nose." For a second, silence, but then Michael's hand trembled. Not a spasm, a controlled movement. His fingers curled as if trying to hold something. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. One of the nurses at the door witnessed it. "My God. He moved again," Grace said, surprised and a bit scared. "Did you see that?" Emily asked the nurse. "That's not a reflex. That's a response." "I'll call the doctor." But Emily didn't hear him. She knelt beside the bed and held her father's hand. "Dad, it's me. Emily, can you hear us?" The monitors remained steady. Michael didn't respond. Grace stood still watching them. After a few seconds, she whispered, "Can I sing a song?" "It was the one I sang to my grandpa when he was sick." Emily nodded, eyes brimming with emotion. Grace began to sing softly. Her voice was sweet, childlike, simple. A snippet of an old lullaby. One of those songs that seemed to cross generations, carrying memories with them. While she sang, something changed. A tear slowly slid down the corner of Michael's eye. Emily saw it. clearly. It wasn't sweat nor moisture from the equipment. It was a tear. She stood up in an instant. "He cried. My father cried." The doctor walked into the room seconds later, having been called urgently. "What's going on here? Look at his face. He's crying." The doctor stepped closer, checked the vitals, wiped the tear with a tissue. He frowned. "It could have been a spontaneous neurological response. We can't conclude anything yet." He cried when she sang. He moved his hand when she touched him. "What else do you need to understand that something is happening here?" "Emily, we need caution. Cases like this create a lot of expectations. It's common for family members to see signs that aren't clinical." "I know what I saw." Grace watched them, not knowing whether she was doing something wrong or right. She only knew that for some reason, that man responded to her, and it didn't feel scary. It felt right. That afternoon, Emily asked for the girl's address. She wanted to meet her family, understand where she came from. Grace hesitated, but eventually agreed. They went together to the Briar Hill Community Favela. Emily had never set foot there. She walked through narrow alleys, clothes hanging on lines, makeshift brick shacks, the smell of food mixed with sewage, children playing barefoot. Inside Grace's shack, her grandmother coughed on an old mattress. Her brother Jacob played with a plastic bottle. Emily remained silent, taking everything in. Grace grabbed a cloth, dampened it, and placed it on her grandmother's forehead. "She gets like this when the weather changes. I make tea and she gets better." Emily felt a knot in her throat. How could that little girl, so young, carry the whole world on her shoulders with such lightness? "You take care of them by yourself?" "Yeah. My mom left. My dad, I never met him." On the way home, Emily barely spoke. But that night, she wrote in her diary, "She lives surrounded by absence. But inside her, she carries a presence we don't understand. And maybe that's what my father felt." Days later, Emily met with the doctors again. "I don't care if you call it reflex, coincidence, or illusion. I saw it. He cried when she sang. He moved his hand when she touched him. My father is trying to come back, and she is the key." Silence filled the room. For the first time, the doctors had no ready answers. And in room 407, Michael's fingers moved once again. Grace's routine changed. Now, 3 times a week, she entered through the back door of Riverside General Hospital, accompanied by Emily. No running, no hiding. There was an improvised badge with her name and a welcoming smile at the reception desk. The doctors, skeptical at first, had given in. They couldn't explain the phenomenon, but they couldn't ignore the signs either. Michael Anderson, immobile and unresponsive for 3 months, was now showing constant reactions, and all of them happened in the girl's presence. Grace didn't understand everything. She only knew that when she touched Michael's hand, he squeezed back, slowly but firmly. When she told stories about Jacob or her grandmother, his heartbeat increased. Sometimes he furrowed his brow as if trying to smile. Sometimes tears fell, and sometimes the entire room went still just to watch a single facial muscle move. "Hi, sir," Grace said every time she walked into the room. "I'm here, okay?" On the 6th visit, she brought a gift. It was a drawing made with borrowed school crayons. Her, Michael, and Emily in a garden. In the picture, Michael was standing without tubes, with his eyes open and a big smile. In the corner, Jacob held a kite. "I made it for you. It's pretty, right?" Grace placed the paper on his lap. Michael didn't answer. But silently, something happened. His eyes opened. Slowly, as if they weighed tons. First one, then the other. They blinked with difficulty. The pupils moved and focused on the drawing, then on her. Grace's eyes widened. Her heart raced. "Sir, can you see me?" He didn't answer with words, but a clear tear rolled down his cheek, and his lips trembled. Grace ran down the corridors. "He opened his eyes! He's awake!" Doctors stormed into the room. Equipment was checked, tests redone. Emily arrived in a rush, unsure if she should believe it or not. But when she walked in and saw her father's eyes open, she couldn't hold back her tears. "Dad." "It's me, Emily. Can you hear me?" Michael blinked twice. Then he moved his eyes toward his daughter. That was all she needed. "My God, you came back." The doctors exchanged glances. None of them dared call it a reflex, not anymore. One of them walked to the doorway and called Grace, who was waiting outside. "You can come in, Grace. He's waiting for you." She stepped in carefully, holding the drawing in her hands. She approached the bed. "It's right here, look. It's you. Awake." Michael looked at the paper, tried to smile. His muscles still didn't obey well, but the intention was there. Emily placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "He reacted to your drawing, Grace, to your kindness. I don't know how to thank you." The girl shrugged as if saying, "You don't need to." That night, Emily went to Grace's home. She brought fruit, medicine, and a volunteer doctor to examine her grandmother. The elderly woman was weak, her lungs compromised. She needed follow-up care and constant treatment. "From now on, you're not alone anymore," Emily said. "I'm going to help, I promise." Grace looked suspicious. She was used to empty promises, but Emily's eyes were different. They were firm, honest. "Okay, but don't send anyone away later, all right?" "Never." In the following days, Emily arranged a small renovation in the girl's home. She got a new bed for the grandmother, bought medicine, food, clothes. She also spoke with the school principal to ensure Grace had school supplies and tutoring. The press began sniffing around the case, but Emily blocked all access. She didn't want Grace turned into a spectacle. She was still just a child who, for some reason, awakened the impossible. At the hospital, Michael underwent intense physical therapy and speech therapy. He still couldn't speak, but his eyes were full of awareness. And whenever Grace was nearby, progress came faster. Her presence seemed to be the bridge between silence and life. One of the doctors started documenting clinical data. He noted everything: motor reactions, heart rate, brain activity. Over time, there was no denying it anymore. There was a direct relationship between Grace's emotional presence and the patient's advances. "I've never seen anything like this," the neurologist said. "If I weren't witnessing it myself, I'd call it fantasy." Emily listened to everything, and silently she began planning something bigger. This couldn't be just an isolated case. What if what was happening here could help other people? What if human connection, genuine affection, could become part of treatment? But that idea was still just a sketch. For now, she only wanted to see her father back, and she wanted Grace close. On Wednesday afternoon, the hospital was quiet. Emily read a book beside her father's bed, while Grace drew on a makeshift table in the corner of the room. Suddenly, Michael moved his lips. A dry sound escaped. Emily jumped to her feet. "Dad, are you trying to talk?" Michael looked at Grace. His eyes were watery, full of effort. Grace walked closer and held his hand. "I'm here, okay? Don't be scared." He tried again. This time the sound came clearer, dragged but audible. You!" Emily cried. Grace cried. And outside, a nurse ran toward the medical room. The man everyone believed was lost was coming back. Michael Anderson relearned how to live. Every movement was a victory. Holding a pen, lifting a spoon, sitting upright for more than 10 minutes. His speech was still slow, spaced out but clear. And his eyes carried the awareness of someone who had seen the edge of the end and returned. "How long?" he asked. his voice hoarse. Emily held his hand. 96 days in a coma, 3 months and 6 days. I almost lost you, Dad. Michael looked around. The room, the machines, the sound of the heart monitor. And then he saw Grace. She was drawing, sitting in the corner of the room, her feet swinging in the air. When she noticed his gaze, she smiled and waved. "Hi, sir. You're better now, right?" Michael blinked slowly, his eyes filled with tears. "I felt you," he said with effort. "Even in the dark, I knew you were here." Grace smiled shyly. "I wasn't going to leave you alone." The news leaked before the hospital could prepare. First, a health blog reported that a well-known businessman had awakened from a coma because of an unknown girl. Then a local newspaper published the story with an old photo of Michael and the headline, "Miracle at Riverside General, the Awakening of the Businessman." Soon, reporters crowded the hospital entrance. Microphones, cameras, drones. They wanted to know everything. The girl's name, how she entered, what she had done. When Emily learned of the commotion, she acted fast. "Close off press access." No one talks to Grace. She's a child, not a circus act. But it wasn't easy to stop an avalanche. Emily did everything she could to shield Grace, changed visiting hours, asked her to come in through a side entrance, increased security. Michael, now out of the ICU, began intensive rehabilitation sessions. As he regained mobility, he also regained voice, and he didn't avoid the subject. All I remember, during that time, is her. The voice, the touch, the song. One of the doctors, who had resisted the word miracle from the beginning, called Emily for a private conversation. "Emily, I admit it. I've never seen anything like this. We're analyzing the EEGs, and there are spikes in brain activity every time she's present. We have no explanation, but we can't deny it." "It's not a miracle," Emily said. "It's affection, connection. Whatever it is, it works." In the physical therapy room, Grace pushed Michael's wheelchair slowly. "I like coming here. It feels like school but without tests," she joked. "Yeah, my new classroom," he replied, still struggling with the words. "And I'm the teacher? The best I've ever had." They laughed. Emily watched from the doorway, emotional. Since Michael woke up, something about him had changed. It wasn't just the body, it was the soul. Once obsessed with profits, meetings, and control, now he seemed lighter, more human. Exposure, however, was inevitable. A journalist managed to discover Grace's name. And worse, her address. Soon, photos of the modest house where she lived began circulating online, along with headlines like, "Poor girl who healed businessman lives in precarious conditions. The child who saved a life, meet Grace, the light of Riverside General Hospital." Emily was furious. "This is an invasion. She didn't ask for any of this. She just wanted to help." But not everyone shared her sensitivity. Business owners started calling, offering advertising campaigns with Grace. "A miracle made for marketing," they said. A health insurance company wanted to film a commercial with her and Michael. A congressman suggested a public tribute, a medal, a speech. Emily refused them all. "Are you out of your minds? She's not a product. She's a child." One reporter insisted on going to Grace's home. He discovered her grandmother was sick, that the house needed repairs. He published a malicious article. "The hospital benefits from miracle, but Savior's family lives in misery." The next day, a TV crew tried to approach Grace at the hospital entrance. "Grace, is it true your grandmother is sick? Do you feel used by them?" the journalist fired, shoving a microphone in her face. Grace froze. She didn't know what to say. Emily intervened, enraged. She pulled Grace away, hugged her tightly, then faced the camera with a firm voice. "Enough!" Silence. Reporters paused. The crew lowered their microphones. She isn't a miracle. She's a child, and she's part of our family now. If any of you have a shred of decency, you'll respect that." That night, Emily sat beside Michael's bed. "The exposure is getting out of control. They're trying to turn everything into a spectacle." "We need to do something," he said. "If they're going to look at us, let it be with purpose, not to exploit, to transform." "What are you talking about?" Michael thought for a moment. "About us, about Grace, about this experience. Maybe we need to create something bigger." Emily stayed quiet. "You mean like a project? An institute? A place where affection is part of treatment? Where what happened here happens for others?" Emily looked at him. It was the first time in years she saw a spark in her father's eyes. "Grace Institute? If she agrees, it's the least we can do." In the corner of the room, Grace was drawing again. On the paper, a tree full of leaves. At the top, 3 people, her, Emily, and Michael, smiling. The building was old, but sturdy. A deactivated hospital in the countryside of Austin, with large windows, a wide courtyard, and empty rooms that now had a new mission. Above the main entrance, a discreet banner displayed a name that, just a few months earlier, no one could have imagined on a healthcare institution. Grace Institute Emotional Therapy and Humanized Intensive Care. Grace squinted at the sign, the sun hitting her eyes. "That's a lot of name, huh?" she said, joking. Emily smiled. "It is, but everyone needs to know who you are." "But I didn't do it alone. And that's why this isn't just your name. It's your story." Everything began with a live interview. After weeks avoiding the press, Emily and Michael decided to give a single press conference under one condition: no questions about Grace's personal life. "Science needs to listen," Michael said. In the packed auditorium, he told his version. He spoke of the emptiness he felt during the coma. The vague sensations, the voices that sometimes echoed far away, like dreams within dreams. And then, the presence that changed everything. "A child walked into my room and touched my nose. It sounds trivial, but at that moment, it was like a light had turned on in the darkness." Grace, shy, sitting beside Emily, listened quietly. By the end of the interview, the whole country knew that girl had done the impossible. The Institute project began as a crazy idea. "Let's open a rehabilitation center focused on emotional connection," Emily suggested. "And use our own case as scientific foundation," Michael added. The first reaction from medical boards was laughter, then shock, then resistance. "This isn't science, it's mysticism. Affection doesn't show up on graphs," but not everyone thought so. Some neurologists began studying the case. Hospital records showed spikes in Michael's brain activity every time Grace entered the room. Specialists called it high-response emotional stimulus. Based on that data came the proposal for affection therapy, sessions in which coma patients would be exposed to voices, scents, touches, and songs that held real emotional meaning. A rescue of memories through emotion. The Grace Institute would be the first lab in the world to test this on a large scale. While the plans unfolded, Grace's life changed too. A private school offered her a full scholarship. Emily hired a tutor for extra classes. Her grandmother, now in regular treatment, had improved. Jacob, her little brother, now had a room of his own. But none of that changed Grace. "Can I keep going to the hospital?" she asked, even with school taking up her days. "Anytime you want," Emily answered. Grace became a constant presence in the Institute's hallways. Not as a symbol, but as a person. She visited rooms, drew pictures for the patients, sang soft songs to those unconscious. "Hi, it's Grace. Everything's okay, all right?" she whispered. And sometimes the monitors showed reactions. Not everyone applauded. Renowned doctors openly criticized it. "This is emotional marketing, not medicine," one said on national TV. "They're playing with families' hopes," another attacked. Emily responded calmly. "Science evolves when someone dares to ask, what if?" That's how antibiotics came to be. And organ transplants. Why not emotion? Michael, now fully recovered, took leadership of the institution. In firm speeches, he presented clinical data, shared cases, graphs, testimonies. "We're not replacing medicine. We're completing what it forgot. The human." In the third month of operation, the institute received a special patient. Caroline, 34, accident victim, in a coma for 11 days. Her husband and 6-year-old son stayed close by. "Can I talk to her?" the boy asked timidly. "Of course," Emily replied. They placed a chair beside the bed. The boy held his mother's hand and said, "Mom, do you remember the playground we used to go to? The one with the red little house?" "Nothing," he continued. "I'm doing good in school. My teacher said I'm good at drawing, just like you." Silence, until the heart monitor rose 1 point, then 2, then 3, and then... Caroline smiled. It was faint, almost invisible, but real. The doctors stared, incredulous. One of them wiped his eyes. The boy beamed. She heard me." Emily, watching from afar with Grace, squeezed the girl's hand. "It's happening again." Grace squeezed back. "Do you think she's gonna wake up?" "I think she already started." That night, Emily and Michael reviewed reports. The institute was receiving letters from all over the world. Doctors asking for protocols, families asking how to replicate the stimuli, universities wanting to study the model. Grace, lying on the couch, doodled in her notebook. "What are you drawing?" Michael asked. "A heart." "Just that?" "A heart with ears, a nose, and a mouth. Because sometimes the heart listens, smells, and talks, even when the person isn't awake." Michael smiled. Emily did too. Outside, the Grace Institute sign glowed in the night. And inside, more silent hearts were beginning to awaken. 7 years had passed. Where there had once been an old, abandoned hospital, now stood an international center for research and rehabilitation. The walls of the Grace Institute had come alive with colors, drawings, voices. Hallways that were once silent now vibrated with music, children's laughter, and the whispers of patients slowly returning to consciousness. Affection therapy was no longer seen with suspicion. It was studied at renowned universities, applied in hospitals around the world, and recognized by the World Health Organization as a revolution in the treatment of coma patients. At the opening of the first International Congress of Affection Therapy in Lisbon, a 16-year-old girl stepped onto the stage. She wore simple clothes, her hair tied back as always, and held the microphone firmly despite her sweaty hands. "My name is Grace. I was just a girl selling candy at a traffic light, until the day I walked into a hospital by mistake and touched the nose of a man I didn't know. He was in a coma, and that day, he moved his fingers." The audience was in absolute silence. Grace continued, "I'm not a doctor. I don't understand neurology. I only know what I felt. I know that affection has power. That sometimes what someone needs to come back is someone calling them. Standing ovation." Emily watched from the front row, emotional. Michael, beside her, applauded with tears in his eyes. Grace became a symbol, not by choice, but because her story touched people deeply. It wasn't about miracles. It was about humanity, about someone invisible becoming essential, and about how science sometimes needs to stop looking only at machines and start listening to the heart. She traveled to many countries: Japan, Germany, South Africa. She took part in panels with scientists, psychologists, spiritual leaders. But she never stopped being the girl who drew hearts with ears and mouths. In every hospital she visited, she asked for one thing: "Let me see the patients." And off she went. She entered slowly, smiled, held the hand of someone who didn't respond, and said, "I'm here, okay?" And now and then, someone smiled. A finger moved. A tear escaped. In a hospital in Mexico, a woman in a coma woke up when she smelled her daughter's perfume. In Angola, a 19-year-old boy reacted to the sound of the song his mother sang when he was little. In Sweden, an elderly man squeezed his grandson's hand after receiving a handwritten letter. The world was watching and changing. Hospitals began creating emotional stimulation rooms, protocols with recordings from family members, personal objects, scents, anything that connected patients to what they knew best: affection. Grace, Emily, and Michael created a foundation that offered free training for medical teams in poor regions. They distributed kits with headphones, sensory cards, and family guidance manuals. More than that, they delivered hope. On one of her trips, Grace visited a public school in the interior of Appalachia. A child raised a hand and asked, "Are you magic?" She smiled. "No, I just like people." Back in Brazil, Grace visited her old home. The shack was now brick, freshly painted. Her grandmother, healthier, drank tea on the porch. Jacob, now 11, studied at a technical school and dreamed of becoming an engineer. "You changed our lives," her grandmother said, emotional. Grace shook her head. "Life changed when people started seeing us." In the final scene of the documentary produced about her story, Grace appears sitting alone in front of the Institute building. She watches children playing in the courtyard, patients in wheelchairs being taken into the sun, mothers singing to children who still hadn't opened their eyes. She smiles, lowers her gaze, and says, "I just wanted to sell some candy." Silence. Then the shot widens to show the facade of the Institute. Emily and Michael appear behind her, the three of them together, in front of what they had built. A red kite flies high in the sky. Inside the Institute, a patient named Joshua, 40 years old, motorcycle accident, 22 days in a coma, lies in bed. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter holds a voice recorder. "Dad, I love you. When you wake up, we're gonna play with the dog, okay?" She presses play. The room fills with the sound of her voice singing softly. Joshua's eyes move, slowly. And then, a tear. The nurse runs to call the doctors, and outside, Grace watches through the window, in silence. She closes her eyes for a moment and smiles. The Grace Institute became more than a medical center. It became a symbol of a new science, of a new perspective, of a new world, not driven only by formulas, graphs, or statistics, but by love. And you? What did you think of this story? If this journey touched you in any way, take a breath and tell me, at what moment did your heart wake up? And from which city are you watching? Your comment, your like, and your subscription help this message reach those who also need a little hope. Thank you for being here.